Leaders from the Global South have set the United Nations General Assembly ablaze in its 80th session, igniting a fiery debate that refuses to be ignored. Reparations for Africa. For years, the subject has been whispered in back rooms, dismissed in diplomatic circles, or shrugged off with vague promises of development aid. But this time, the calls came roaring from the podiums of presidents who carried the weight of centuries on their shoulders. The issue wasn't presented as a polite request or scholarly suggestion. It was thrown down like a gauntlet, sparking renewed conversations about colonialism, slavery, and the catastrophic impact they left on the African continent and beyond. Has the moment finally come when the world will be forced to confront the debt it owes Africa, not in charity, but in justice? Ghana's President John Dramani Mahama set the tone with a blistering speech that branded the transatlantic slave trade as the greatest crime against humanity and demanded the world finally acknowledge that truth. Picking up the momentum, Central African Republic President Faustin Archange Touadera emphasized Africa's demand for true sovereignty and an end to exploitative global dynamics. Bolivian President Luis Alberto A's Catacora then joined the chorus with a concrete roadmap outlining a vision for reparations through financial justice, environmental repair, and solidarity between the Global South. Here is what each of these leaders said in their own words.
Madam President, the slave trade must be recognized as the greatest crime against humanity. As the African champion on reparations, Ghana intends to introduce a motion in this August body to that effect. More than 12.5 million Africans were forcibly taken against their will and transported to create wealth for the powerful Western nations. We must demand reparations for the enslavement of our people and the colonization of our land that resulted in the theft of our natural resources, as well as the looting of artifacts and other items of cultural heritage that have yet to be returned in total. We recognize the value of our land and the value of our lives, as did our colonizers, as well as the governments that happily paid reparations to former slave owners as compensation for the loss of their property in quotes. And that property for which they received compensation was paid referred to enslaved people who had been freed.
Africa is not a continent that needs simply help. It's a continent that is awaiting courageous partnerships. The role of Africa in the community of nations must be respected. Sovereignty rather than subordination. Partnership rather than exploitation. It is unacceptable that poverty is worsening in Africa while wealth is accumulating in the northern countries. It's time for the injustices caused Africa to be repaired. That is why the Central African Republic supports the Pan-African Initiative on Reparations, as well as the efforts of the continent aimed at establishing a respectful and equitable dialogue with partners.
I wish to propose that we firstly establish a commission for reparations following slavery, apartheid, genocide and colonialism in the countries of the Global South. To do so, the United Nations should find a way to ensure that those designing war and death pay their billions of dollars rather into a reparations fund. I hope that this rostrum, the highest on the international stage, will also serve to be able to launch an appeal and recognize that colonialism and neocolonialism was and is an historic mistake that brings and continues to bring a social wound over the population that it victimizes. It also does this with indigenous societies that it affects in particular. Today, on behalf of the construction of a fair future, we have to condemn the devastating impact of colonialism in the past and the present. I appeal to the heads of state of CELAC and the African Union to join forces and to oppose the adverse consequences of colonialism. This commission that I've mentioned should set up effective mechanisms to restore historic justice in the following spheres: reparations, land rights, recovery of the environment destroyed through the action of the colonizers and transnational corporations, apologies for the colonial past through the restitution of cultural goods of the indigenous peoples that were taken by the colonizers during the period of expansion and genocide, the prevention of neocolonial practices, programs for the development of indigenous peoples and the preservation of their cultural identity.
The energy in the room was undeniable, but so was the frustration. A common theme echoed by all three leaders was sheer disappointment with the global north. Time and again, Western countries have sidestepped the conversation, offering development projects here and debt relief schemes there, but never grappling with the root of the matter, that they owe a moral and material debt to the people they enslaved, colonized, and exploited. Isn't the silence of the global north itself a form of arrogance, a refusal to admit responsibility even in the face of undeniable history? The coordinated stance by these leaders made one thing clear: this issue can no longer be swept under the carpet. To truly understand the weight of these demands, we have to revisit the painful backdrop they stand on. The transatlantic slave trade wasn't just a transportation of bodies. It was a systematic destruction of societies. Millions were dragged away from their homelands, torn from families, stripped of culture, and forced into brutal labor. For those who remained on the continent, the story was equally grim. Communities were destabilized, economies collapsed, and kingdoms fractured under the relentless demand for human cargo. The continent was not just robbed of its people, but also of its chance to develop on its own terms. This isn't ancient history. It is the foundation of today's global inequality. When you look at Africa's underdevelopment and the West's prosperity, isn't it obvious that one is a direct product of the other? And so, when Mahama, Touadera, and Arce call for reparations, they aren't simply playing politics. They are drawing a straight line between yesterday's atrocities and today's inequalities. Their comments aren't only appropriate, they are overdue. For centuries, African voices demanding reparations have been dismissed as unrealistic or radical. Yet, hasn't history always shown us that what was once called radical eventually becomes common sense? There was a time when abolition itself seemed impossible, when independence for African states was unthinkable, when the end of apartheid felt like a dream. Could reparations be the next chapter in this long story of justice delayed, but not denied? Still, the big question hangs in the air. Is reparations really possible? Western nations have mastered the art of avoiding the issue. Some argue it's too complex. Who would pay? How much? And to whom? Others pretend that enough time has passed, as if centuries of oppression can simply be shrugged off because it's all in the past. But is time really a healer when its wounds are still visible in the poverty, inequality, and stolen futures across Africa and the diaspora? Perhaps the real fear is not about logistics, but about accountability. For if the West admits to owing Africa reparations, doesn't it also admit that its entire wealth is built on the backs of stolen labor and stolen land? The 80th UN General Assembly might well be remembered as a turning point. This wasn't just another round of speeches destined to fade from headlines in a week. It was a declaration that the global South is no longer willing to beg for acknowledgement. It was a call for justice, and more importantly, a warning that the chorus of reparations is growing louder, stronger, and more united. If the world continues to ignore it, what happens then? Will Africa and its allies chart their own course? creating new systems of power that finally sideline the old colonial masters? In the end, reparations may be more than just money. They are about dignity, about rewriting the story of Africa and the global south, not as victims of history, but as rightful claimants of justice. The leaders who spoke at the UN this year have planted a seed. Whether it grows into real action depends on whether the world is ready to confront the truth it has long avoided. But one thing is certain. The demand is no longer a whisper. It's a roar. And once a roar begins, can it ever really be silenced? Your perspective matters. Do you agree that the West should pay heavy reparations to Africa over colonialism and slave trade? Share your thoughts and insights in the comment section below. If you like this video, be sure to subscribe to the New Africa channel and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any of our informative future videos. Stay informed, stay engaged, and thank you for watching.